We're turning now to the Greek of Genesis chapter 2, picking up in verse 1. Kai suniteles thesan ha uranos, kai hege, kai pas ha cosmos, alton. Let's start with a minor observation about the repetition of kai, not only in this verse, but in fact 31 times in Genesis 1. Quite a lot. Now, I didn't really draw a lot of attention to it. This represents the vav, or waw, underneath the hood in Hebrew, which is also repeated. And this kind of syntax is known as parataxis. And that is where basically you have kai linking sentence upon sentence upon sentence or clauses, keeping everything kind of at the same narrative level as opposed to other discourse markers that advance the narrative. And it just happens to be something that is very common in Greek Genesis and elsewhere, particularly translating the underlying Hebrew. But let's begin with the first verb, sunitelesthesan. This is from sunteleo. And if you know some vocab, you probably see telos here. The Hebrew is kalab. Both of these words basically mean to complete or to bring to its completion, something along those lines. But you'll see there's a thesan here and an epsilon tucked in there. So this tells us this is a third plural aorist passive indicative. And so why is it plural? Well, the writer here is picking up that it's heaven, earth, and the hakosmos that are now being brought to completion. So it'd be something like, and were brought to completion, ha-uranos and the gay, the earth. Now this is referring back to Genesis 1:1, where God made the uranon and the gain. So there's a nice connectivity here going back all the way to Genesis 1. The heaven and the earth were brought to completion. But the final clause here is a bit tricky. Although the vocab is quite straightforward. So it's pas, every or all. And then we have hakosmos here. Now, you would typically translate this just based on sort of Greek 1 vocab as world. But that wouldn't really seem to fit here, especially with this genitive plural alton. How in the world could it be, their world, as if the world belonged to Uranos and the gay? Well, the underlying Hebrew here is hosts, which doesn't necessarily help us here. But cosmos can also mean arrangement or design. And this gives us a chance to take a look at an important resource, a dedicated Septuagint lexicon. There's actually a couple of these. I'm going to focus on the one by Myriaka, the Greek English lexicon of the Septuagint. Of course, you might be familiar with other lexicons from the New Testament, but this is really the gold standard for the Septuagint. And let's take a look at the entry for cosmos here. And so here you have your verb that, again, in Greek 1 you learn as world. But in fact, the very first gloss that Myriaka lists is the ordered whole consisting of, actually there's not a gloss, it's the definition, consisting of multiple units. Notice that Genesis 2:1 is used here as the main example. It's the subsidiary components of the universe. So it's something like heaven and earth and all of their components or their ordered arrangement or something along those lines. Then you have created world as kind of the main definition for most uses. But here, Myriaka lists the breakdown of the components, the inner workings of it as an option for cosmos. So I find that to be quite an interesting translation of the Hebrew hosts. Kind of makes sense, actually, once you realize that cosmos can mean the whole series of things that make something, namely the heaven and the earth. So good introduction to a very important lexicon. I'm sure we'll come back to it again in the future.